This video is brought to you by Surfshark VPN. Hey guys, Jay here. So today we're going to be talking about speakers between the range of $1,000 to about $3,000. And in this price category, hi-fi speakers can be very competitive. But that also means that we've seen a lot of great speakers at this price point that really punches above its price point. For example, the Buchardt S400 Mark II was a great loudspeaker for around $2,500, and even a kit speaker like the CSS1TDX that brought tremendous value, allowing you to build it yourself. And today, I have the KEF R3 META as well as the Q Concerto META, which is two of the loudspeakers that have been raved about between reviewers and owners alike. So, with that being said, do these speakers sound better, and is it better than what is currently on my recommendation list? That's exactly what we're gonna find out today by comparing 6 different loudspeakers in this price category. Now, I had a lot of time to spend with the KEF R3 META as well as the Q Concerto META, and both those speakers are fairly similar. Heck, if you look at it from far away, they look almost identical, and you probably can't tell which speaker is which. But there are key differences, starting with the price. The KEF R3 META is $2,500, which is almost the double price of the Q Concerto META, which is about $1,299. The KEF R3 META is an easier speaker to drive by a slight bit, about 87 dB compared to 85 dB on the Q Concerto. However, in the real life situation, I did find that even though the sensitivity difference between the speakers is only 2 dB, I did find that the Concerto needed more power, and that I did end up cranking the volume higher with the Q Concerto than I ever did with the R3 META. Both speakers are built relatively well for their price range. The KEF R3 META, for example, in my opinion, is one of the leaders in terms of the construction of the speaker in this price category. It is really, really well built. And it also has finish options that I personally think is prettier than the Concerto. But the Concerto also has that walnut finish, which I have in hand, that does look quite good, even though it is, I believe, a wrap. It looks very much veneer, and it is a very high quality loudspeaker finish. Well, even though that's the case, the bracing is not quite there like the R3 META, and the R3 META's weight, in physical weight, is much more hefty. The other small difference is in the binding post. While the Q Concerto META has only a single binding post, not bi-wireable or anything fancy like that, the R3 META, on the other hand, is bi-wireable and bi-ampable as well, with a higher quality binding post, of course. Honestly, when it comes to build quality, both speakers pass the mark, and I would rate the KEF R3 META out of 6.5 out of 10 in terms of build quality, easily being able to be 7 if it was that beautiful indigo finish. While I would rate the KEF Concerto's build quality out of 5 out of 10. Now, with that being said, both of these speakers have more similarities than differences in terms of technology. Now, before I go over those technology differences, a message from the sponsor of today's video, Surfshark. So Surfshark is a VPN service, and if you haven't heard VPN because you were living under a rock, well, it is a must to have for your own security online so that you're not tracked on the things that you do on the web. But most importantly, for me, you guys know I went to Asia recently, and without VPN, I really wouldn't have been able to survive, especially in China. And being able to use VPN to access the web browsers and the things that I did back home was a blessing. Because when I was in Japan, I did not understand any of those Japanese shows because they were all in Japanese. But VPN isn't only for traveling. When I came back from Asia, I missed the shows that I watched in Korea, and I was trying to find the websites that I watched them on, but even on Netflix, I wasn't able to find the shows that I was watching, and I wanted to know what the next episode was about. And yes, the number one reason for you to get VPN is for internet security, so that you're incognito while you're surfing on the web, like I said. However, it is by no mistake that for such an affordable value that Surfshark is offering, you're able to access shows and movies, thousands of them, that I would have not been able to without VPN. So instead of signing up for another subscription of streaming services, check out Surfshark in the link description below. Right now, they're offering my viewers a 30-day money-back guarantee, as well as extra 4 months by using the code iyagi. So there's no risk, do it now. With that being said, back to the video. So like I said, both of these speakers have a lot in common. For example, they both have the dual concentric driver that KEF is famous for, the Uni-Q driver array. And what this means essentially, for those of you that don't know, is that this is a three-way loudspeaker, which means it has a tweeter, mid-range woofer, and a woofer. However, if you see on the speakers, you can see that there seems to be only two drivers. What's going on? Well, the tweeter is actually embedded right in the middle of the mid-woofer. And this is advantageous for many different reasons, but one of it is that awesome imaging capability, which means that you're gonna get dead center imaging with these type of drivers. As well, it's just a matter of fact that both the mid-range and the high frequency is coming from the same point source, which is a really, really good advantage for a speaker to have. It's going to allow for that more coherent sound. But if you look closely, there are differences between the concentric drivers in the Q Concerto versus the R3 Meta. So the R3 Meta's drivers are slightly bigger opposed to the Q Concerto's slightly smaller drivers. For example, the R3 Meta's tweeter is 25mm or 1 inch, while the Q Concerto's tweeter is about 19mm, about 0.75 inch. And the mid-range driver surrounding the tweeter on the R3 Meta is about 5 inches, while the Q Concerto's is about 4 inches. I do think that it's interesting that the R3 Meta has bigger drivers because the Q Concerto, when it comes to mid-range and tweeter, having a smaller driver can be an advantage of its own, as some of you may know. Aside from that, they both have the Meta technology, which is this disc-like kind of thing that sits on the back side of the tweeter and absorbs all the unwanted frequencies that's coming from the rear to inside the cabinet of the tweeter, and it absorbs 99% of those kind of standing waves and reflections, which adds to the fidelity of the loudspeaker, as this is one of the things that a lot of designers do. They stuff the cabinet with foam or some type of wool or some kind of material to combat those standing waves and those unwanted frequencies coming from the rear of the tweeter. So in theory, both of these speakers have what is important to the KEF speaker's DNA in terms of technology. It's not really missing out on the metamaterial technology as well as the dual concentric driver design. Not to mention that the woofers are also the same size as 6.5 inches for both speakers, and they're both hybrid aluminum cone design, which means that it's an aluminum coating on a paper woofer to add stiffness to the overall woofer. In terms of placement, I found that these speakers are fairly standard and traditional and not a big hassle to set up to make it sound good. First of all, you do need some space from the wall. I would say about 1 to 2 feet at the minimum, because both of these speakers are rear ported. So if you place them too close to the wall, they may get a little bit boomy and muddy sounding. I would also highly suggest that you play with toe-in for the first week or two that you have the speakers, and just experiment. Toe them closer to you to align the focus a little bit more sharply, and then start towing them away to see how much soundstage you're getting versus the focus. And this is very standard. The more you tow the speaker towards you, the more focused sweet spot that you're gonna get. And the more you tow it out towards, away from your ears, you're gonna find that you're gonna get more kind of soundstage, more of a wider and a more enveloping kind of sound. So experiment with what you like, but I personally liked it with a slight bit of toe-in, as these speakers already have amazing imaging capabilities, so I didn't feel that I needed to tow them all that much. The biggest thing though is having the right stand size. And thankfully, KEF makes the S3 stands, which bolts on to the speakers, which I really like so that it doesn't tip over. And I've had a few oopsie moments where my panel back there fell over while my dogs were going out in the backyard, and I was like, oh my god, and it didn't fall because I had it bolted onto the stand. So I highly recommend the S3 stands, but if not, finding the right height is the most important thing, as the dual concentric drivers on both of these speakers must be aligned with your ears for the best sound outcome. And talking about the stands, you'll notice that I don't have the spikes that comes with the stands. In fact, I have my tough cones on it. And if you haven't watched my video on the tough cones, this thing is absolutely revolutionary in terms of isolation. I highly recommend it, and it's much more affordable than other counterparts while really outperforming the others. And on the stand, I've tried both back and forth, the spikes and the tough cones, and no question, really elevates not just the bass performance and how tight and how textured and how defined it is, but the mid-range and treble is just more nuanced, more detailed and quieter. It's just a very, very good tweak to have. So I definitely recommend checking it out. And talking about the best sound outcome, both of these speakers are much easier in terms of amplifier matching than the speakers I found in this price category. While the Buchardt S400 Mark II may prefer one amplifier versus the other, and so does the KEF LS50 Meta, which is very notorious for having the right power behind it to make it sound good, well, the R3 Meta I found is fairly good sounding with most amplifiers, even budget ones. I personally really loved this combination of the live harmony mono blocks along with the tube preamplifiers from Auric that I have, the Motherload XL with its dedicated power supply. But if that's a little bit too pricey for you, I mean, even the Emotiva Bass X that I'm in the process of reviewing sounded really, really great with the KEF R3 Meta. All I would say is that you would need a little bit more power to have that more bass oomph. But if you're a tube lover, even the Brunico or even the Cayenne Jazz 80 that I've been reviewing sounds phenomenal with these speakers in a more compact room. Now the Q Concerto Meta is a little bit of a different story. Not that it's more sensitive to gear matching, but I would definitely want a little bit more power and handling for those bass frequencies to be a little bit more controlled and more tight and come to life with a little bit more authority. And for that, I personally really like Hagel all-in-one integrated amplifiers, and you can go with the more entry level than the one I have here. But it's really generally a well-known fact that Hagel integrated amplifiers sound really great with KEF speakers, and if you want something minimalistic and all-in-one that does streaming and preamplifier, amplifier, just one box with the speakers, I think the Hagel units are a phenomenal synergistic match with KEF speakers, both the R3 and the Q Concerto Meta. But the Q Concerto Meta needed a little bit more of the Hagel's capability to grab those bass and be a little bit more authoritative and controlled. And if your budget is really tight, here's a pro tip. The SMSL Gauntlet amplifier monoblocks, 2 of them, will cost you really nothing compared to the amplifiers that I'm talking about now, even compared to the speaker's pricing. And it just sounds phenomenal with both the R3 Meta as well as the Q Concerto Meta, and will have no problem driving it and has heaps amounts of power. So there's a little tip for you if you want something mini sized and that can sound great with these speakers. So how do these speakers sound? Well, let's start with the KEF R3 Meta. First of all, the R3 Meta is an all-rounder speaker right off the bat, meaning from bass, mid-range to treble, there's really not much to complain about and it excels in every category. But I would say the highlight of the show for me with the R3 Meta was ironically the treble, which I quite didn't like on the original R3. The R3 Meta has an immensely more refined treble. I also find the R3 Meta to be a more meat-to-the-bone type of sound, meaning the mid-range is going to sound more fuller, the bass is going to be a little bit more voluptuous. I know some people hate me using that word, but more, voluptuous, like hair. Think of the more voluptuous hair or something. And it's just going to be a more inviting, warmer, more fuller type of sound compared to the Q Concerto Meta as well as the original R3. However, it is not an overly warm type of sound that the speaker gives. If anything, it's actually on the a little bit more brighter end. So don't be mistaken, this is not a warm speaker, but compared to the R3 or the Q Concerto Meta, I find the R3 Meta to be a more fuller, more meat to the bone type of sound, especially in that mid-range. Now, the Q Concerto Meta is not as a all-rounder speaker compared to the R3 Meta in my opinion. And I say that because even though it's in general terms an all-rounder speaker, it has good bass, mid-range, and treble, nothing to really complain about here, especially given the price point, that's half of the R3 Meta. I will say the Q Concerto Meta has a little bit more of a V-shaped sound. What that means is that it has a little bit more bass oomph and has a little bit more treble kind of presence up and forward. And the mid-range because of this type of sound, has a little bit of a drawback, so you need to crank up that volume, as we'll talk about in a minute, to bring that mid-range up a little bit and have that more fuller, more balanced type of sound. In terms of bass, both are quite satisfactory for me in terms of texture, the quality of bass, and even without a subwoofer in a small to medium-sized room, I would rate the bass of the R3 Meta at a 7 out of 10, while for the Concerto, I would rate it 6 out of 10. So in terms of dynamics and the bass capabilities, it's quite similar. I would say the R3 Meta digs a little bit lower and has a little bit more dynamics and texture to the bass, but they're quite similar. Now, in the mid-range, it is not as close. Like I said, with the R3 Meta, there's just more meat to the bone. It's just a more pleasing, fuller sound, at least to me, in that mid-range. On top of that, it just sounds more refined than the original R3 or the Q Concerto Meta in comparison. It just sounds more refined, smoother, while having all those nuances and details in the mid-range that I would ever want to hear. In fact, I would say it's more detailed and more nuanced than the Q Concerto Meta or the original R3. Despite that, it's easier to listen to, it's more fuller, and it's more delicate and more smooth and easier on the ears to digest the music, which in turn also makes it a more forgiving loudspeaker for the different types of music that you may be playing or the quality of the recording as well. It just does better with poorer recordings than the original R3 or the Q Concerto Meta. Now, the Q Concerto Meta, on the other hand, has a little bit more of that upper zing when it comes to the upper mid-range. It has a little bit more zing, which can feel like it's a little bit more realistic in the strings, but it's not as refined as the R3 Meta and can be a little bit fatiguing at higher volumes. Now, this is not a fatiguing loudspeaker, I would say, but it's still a little bit more zingy and less refined, a little bit more grainy compared to the mid-range of the R3 Meta. And perhaps because of that V-shaped sound that I was talking about with the Q Concerto, this a little bit plays into that kind of double-edged sword analogy, because with the V-shaped sound on this loudspeaker particularly, I find that anything without vocals, so remember the mid-range is a little bit recessed, so anything without vocal sounds excellent. So instrumentals, and if you play music mostly without vocals, then this might be a bargain because it sounds lifelike, the soundstage explodes, and because the high frequency is a little bit more uplifted than the R3 Meta, like I mentioned, it has that more sensation of space and more kind of spacious kind of presentation that makes you feel like it just has a larger soundstage. But on the other hand, like I mentioned, if you play anything with vocals, then you may feel like it is a little bit more imbalanced in comparison to the bass or the treble frequency, and you might end up feeling like you need to crank up that volume a little bit to bring up the vocal range. And if you're thinking, well, then it's gonna raise the bass and the treble, yes. However, our ears are meant to digest the frequencies more linear as we increase the volume. So it's not like this forever, it ends up becoming more like this as you crank up the volume. So, just a quick note there. I really wouldn't describe either of these speakers to be harsh or unrefined. In fact, the Q Concerto Meta, I would say, is even more refined than the original R3. So we're already kind of up there with the Q Concerto Meta. It's just that the R3 Meta is more refined, just on a class of its own. So this is how I would rate the treble. For the R3 Meta, I would rate it 8 out of 10, which is really high score for me. And for the Concerto, I would rate it 6 out of 10. Now, this is the only category that the Q Concerto is gonna win, and that is the soundstage. The Concerto, I would rate it at 6.5 out of 10, while the R3 Meta, I would rate it 6 out of 10. So what we're talking about here is how wide and deep the overall sound is. So the staging that the music takes place, how realistic is it, how wide, how deep is it? Now, mostly, I would describe both of these speakers to have an adequate, kind of lifelike soundstage. So realistic. It's not so big or so deep that it feels like a grand hall, but it feels like more like an intimate kind of venue. So pretty good. However, the reason the Q Concerto Meta scores higher than the R3 Meta in my mind is because during my listening session, I just found that when I hooked up the Q Concerto Meta, the soundstage seemed a little bit more spacious. Not necessarily felt like it was wider or deeper or anything like that, but it just seemed like the details were a little bit more breathing and more spacious. And the reason for that is because of the higher frequency boost on the Q Concerto Meta opposed to the R3 Meta. So in the frequency range, if you boost the upper high frequencies, then you end up getting a little bit more space, which for me gives me a little bit more advantage in terms of sound staging at the expense of the refinement. So is it the refinement of the R3 Meta that you want, or do you want a little bit more spacious, exciting sound of the Q Concerto? That's for you to choose. Now, however, this is a completely different story when it comes to separation within the soundstage. So now what we're talking about here is the separation of individual instruments within the soundstage given. And here, I find the R3 Meta to be much more superior compared to the Q Concerto Meta. And the reason for that is because the R3 Meta just seems to separate and declutter the soundstage a lot easier. So you're able to decipher the vocal in the middle, the bass back there, with the guitar up front on the left. Like, you can tell these things more easily without any clutter. While on the same track, the Q Concerto Meta, especially at higher volumes, start to be a little bit more cluttered, especially with those more busier tracks with multi-instruments like a classical or a R&B or jazz even. It just has a little bit more clutter and clumpiness when it comes to louder volumes, especially with the Q Concerto Meta compared to the R3 Meta's more decisive and separated kind of instrumental separation within the soundstage. I would rate the R3 Meta's separation capability 7 out of 10, while I would rate the Concertos at 6 out of 10. Now, where both of these speakers excel at is imaging capability. I mean, the ability for both of these speakers to image and have great phantom center, just dead locked in the center, is amazing. It has very, very phase coherent sound, and you can tell the guitar and the instruments, placement very, very well. Like, you can draw it, right? And the R3 Meta is better at that at higher volumes, but the Q Concerto at this price point is no joke either. Now, with this being said, I would rate the R3 Meta at an 8.5 out of 10 and the Concerto at 8 out of 10 for this imaging capability. Now, both of these speakers are fantastic speakers at low volume listening level, which is quite extraordinary at this price point. And not a lot of speakers sound actually good at low volumes, but the R3 Meta especially sounds really exceptional at low volumes in my opinion. It is just more nuanced and balanced overall from bass to treble, and it's just a more enjoyable, inviting kind of experience while still getting all the details in the bass and the treble. At a volume at 70 dB or less, I would rate the R3 Meta at a 7 out of 10, while I would rate the Concerto at a 5.5 out of 10. And again, the reason Q Concerto Meta scores lower on this category is because of that V-shaped sound. When it comes to vocal tracks, well, it doesn't do so well at lower volumes because I have to crank up more and more to start hearing those vocals more readily compared to the other frequencies. However, this does mean that the Q Concerto is better at mid to higher volumes than it is at lower volumes. However, I still think the R3 Meta is better at medium to higher volumes than the Q Concerto. While the Q Concerto does need a little bit more volume to come alive, the R3 Meta doesn't really need volume to come alive, but it sounds really full and authoritative as you crank up the volume. So it excels at low, medium, and high volume for the R3 Meta, while the Q Concerto, for me to enjoy it fully, even with vocals, I would need at least medium to higher volumes, so anything above 70 dB and 80 dB and higher for higher volumes. So I would rate the R3 Meta at a 7.5 out of 10 for higher volume playback, while the Concerto, I would rate it 6.5 out of 10. So lastly, in terms of value, even though the R3 Meta is a more pricey loudspeaker, I think it offers more value for the money that you pay than the Q Concerto. And the Q Concerto is really good bang for your buck, but I just don't think it's the best bang for your buck when you compare it with all the things that you get with the R3 Meta. So I would rate the R3 Meta's value at 8.5 out of 10, while I would rate the Concerto at 8. Not a huge point difference considering what I just said, but at the same time, you'll see in a minute, Q Concerto does offer a lot at its price point, and it's just not fair to compare it to something that's double the price. So it still scores higher in the value scale. Now, the total score of the R3 Meta here is 73.5 out of 100 between all the categories, and the Concerto 63.5 out of 100. Just for your reference, and if you are scoring along with me, your scores may vary. Now, in terms of comparison to the other speakers, there's 2 references for each of the price ranges in my tier list. These speakers are what I personally found until now to be the best performance in each of these categories. And you can find this list in the link description below. Now, the question is, will the R3 Meta or the Q Concerto be replacing any of these speakers? Let's start with the almighty Buchardt S400 Mark II. Very quickly, in terms of build quality, I would have to give it to the R3 Meta. It's just built more substantially and more robustly, in my opinion. The Buchardt S400 Mark II is a smaller loudspeaker in comparison, and despite the rosewood finish that I have here looking very, very sexy, I would say the R3 Meta just is a better build in terms of construction. It just feels more substantial and more robust. In terms of bass, honestly, both of these speakers, despite the Buchardt S400 Mark II being a smaller loudspeaker, it really doesn't, slouch in terms of comparison to the R3 Meta's bass, which is impressive. The Buchardt S400 and the R3 Meta, both of these speakers are really dynamic and extending and mimics a larger floor standing loudspeaker in terms of its bass capabilities. So in terms of bass, I think anyone would be happy with the quality that you get here with both of these bookshelves, considering the size of the S400 Mark II especially. However, I will say that by a smidge, the R3 Meta extends a little bit lower and is more distinctive in its bass. And I feel like the quality of the bass in terms of texture as well is slightly more to my liking with the R3 Meta. The R3 Meta in terms of the mid-range and treble is going to be a more cleaner and more transparent kind of presentation opposed to the more warmer and inviting sound of the Buchardt S400 Mark II. So if you're someone that wants a really inviting sound like Sonos Faber type of sound, then I would say the Buchardt S400 Mark II may tickle your feathers. But I would say that the R3 Meta is also now full sounding in the mid-range, and it's just better with separation and the detail level and the nuance that I look for in a high-end hi-fi speaker. So I would have to give it to the R3 Meta in terms of the mid-range and treble quality. As well, the treble quality is just really excellent on the R3 Meta. It's very refined, very smooth, while still having all that detail, kind of reminding me of a higher end speaker like the Rosso Fiorentino Sotaldo 2 loudspeakers that I reviewed, but in a way more extended and airy even than that. So while I would say the Buchardt S400 Mark II is really excellent in that regard as well, with smooth and really refined and even smoother than the R3 Meta in that regard, I say that the R3 Meta has a more kind of finesse on the top edge, right? It has more detail and nuance, but without getting fatiguing, and has that refinement that I just love. I think the highlight again is that treble on the R3 Meta that is really hard to beat even for the Buchardt S400 Mark II. I will say though, if you're someone that wants a more inviting sound than even what the R3 Meta offers, the Buchardt S400 Mark II is the answer. It is smoother than the R3 Meta, like I said. It's more inviting, warmer, and richer sounding. So overall, it's going to be an easier speaker to digest with variety of types of music. And also, I would say that if you have to have the speakers closer to the wall, I think the Buchardt S400 Mark II is better. And also, if you need to crank up the volume, if you're someone that likes to play at louder volumes, I think the Buchardt S400 Mark II is a slightly safer choice, as opposed to the R3 Meta that does need a little bit more breathing room to make it really sound glorious. So I think most of us can agree that these two speakers just have a different presentation of sound, and they're both really excellent speakers regardless. So I would say that I wouldn't replace the Buchardt S400 Mark II with the R3 Meta just yet. As for the other speaker on this list, the Arendal 1723 THX S monitor. This speaker is formidable in its own right, with impeccable measured performance, an easier sensitivity rating, and impedance load for the amplifier to drive. It is also impeccably built with HDF instead of MDF, which HDF is a higher quality wood material for cabinets that's used in much higher end designs. It is also backed by Arendal's extremely generous return policy as well as their customer service. Overall, sound-wise, this speaker is going to offer very similarly to the R3 Metas a clean, transparent, and a well-balanced overall sound. But I find the R3 Metas to be overall more spacious sounding and engaging, yet still more refined in the mid-range and treble than the Arendal. I think the Arendals are by definition more colorless, and in terms of neutrality, it is more neutral. So for those listeners that's chasing for absolute neutrality in their sound, I still think the Arendal 1723 THX-S monitor is the more linear and neutral loudspeaker. Both excel at lower to higher volumes, but I find the R3 Metas to be a clear winner in the dynamics and extension it provides in the bass. Like I mentioned in the Arendal review, I do need a subwoofer with this speaker in particular, and by adding two subwoofers like the Arendal 1S, yes, this speaker setup can be elevated to something even better than the R3 Metas perhaps. However, it's going to add significant cost because the subwoofers are not cheap. The R3 Meta is also going to be easier to find a stand for that will look good, while the Arendals are a little bit oddly shaped and it may be harder to find the right stand for it. Now, Arendal used to make stands for them, but they no longer do for the specific speaker lineup, so that's a little bit of a bummer. You're gonna have some, issues finding the speaker stands, but I'll link to some speaker stands in the description that worked with me for the Arendals. If you need to place the speakers closer to wall boundaries, however, I would say the Arendals are a better choice, as again, the R3 Metas need room to breathe to sound its best. It's fairly close, but it's the refinement and the more engaging sound, the soundstage, and the dynamics of the R3 Metas that's going to be replacing the Arendals on this list. Now let's see how its little brother, the Concerto, does against its competitors. So first up is the CSS-1TDX speaker kit. This speaker has been my longtime favorite, and it is also a kit speaker, which means you build it yourself to save on the cost. And this means that you can opt to get the superior crossover and the Baltic Birch flat pack while still being well within the price bracket. But this also means that finishing the speaker as well as building it is entirely up to your time and cost, and however you want to calculate that is entirely up to you. But yes, you do save moolah because it's a kit and you build it yourself. It is a slightly smaller speaker than the Concerto, but still provides bass extension and dynamics to match even the R3 Metas and the S400 Mark II. And interestingly, even though this speaker has a cleaner and a more transparent sound in the mid-range and high frequency, it is still more engaging, yet still inviting and easier to digest with poorer recordings especially than the Concerto in my opinion. In fact, in terms of refinement, the overall tonality of the instruments and the vocals, in almost every category, I prefer the CSS-1TDX over the Concerto, except for one thing. Like I said, the Concerto, because of its V-shaped sound nature that we've been talking about, it does have that more spacious nature, and because of that, it does sound more spacious in terms of its soundstage presentation than the CSS-1TDX, but in terms of pure value, I think the CSS-1TDX is still hard to beat for the Concerto, and therefore is not going to be removed from the list. But how about against the KEF LS50 Meta? And the reason this comparison is interesting is that the KEF LS50 Meta is slightly more expensive than the Concerto right now for about extra $100, so it's almost exactly the same price. So considering that, which one is the better speaker? And most importantly, which one is best bang for your buck? There's few things to consider. First of all, the Concerto is a much larger loudspeaker than the LS50 Meta. The LS50 Meta is a compact speaker with the UniQ driver, and both of them have the Meta material because the Meta generation came out with all of them. But at the same time, this also means that the pricing of the Concerto is very attractive because this is a three-way loudspeaker. So not only do you get the dual concentric driver, but you get a 6.5-inch woofer, which allows the speaker to be much more dynamic than what LS50 Meta can do by itself, and even though they're pretty evenly matched in terms of sensitivity and impedance, I find the Concerto to be much easier to pick an amplifier to sound great with, given that it has some power, compared to the LS50 Meta, which I've had tremendous luck with some amplifiers, while the other ones were just not it. So LS50 Meta is finicky with amplifier pairings, and that's why a lot of people have different opinions about it. The Concerto, I think, is a much easier speaker to pair with an amplifier and just sound good right off the bat. You could add two KC62 subwoofers to the LS50 Meta setup to have sub bass, to treble, just amazing kind of sound. I made a whole video about that setup. However, that will also increase the price dramatically, even though this system will outcompete the Concerto by far. And besides, I do find the Concertos to be more fun and engaging to listen to, and you can tell it's a more proper, bigger loudspeaker within the first few tracks. I also find the overall refinement on both speakers to be on par with each other. While the Q Concerto, I like it a little bit more because it has less dryness on the upper mid-range, and overall, it's just a little bit more funner and a fuller sound than the LS50 Meta. So along with the more fuller sound and a more dynamic sound with on par refinement as the KEF LS50 Meta with a slightly less dryish sound, I think that it's an easy choice for me to remove the KEF LS50 Meta for the first time and replace it with the Q Concerto. It's the new king in town. However, I will say this, the LS50 Meta is a better speaker for near field and desktop environments where you don't have flexibility to be able to pull the speakers out into the room, because like I said, the Concertos, like the R3 Metas, do require a little bit more room to breathe. So if you are on a desktop environment, then the KEF LS50 Meta might be a better choice. So with that being said, I hope this video answered all your questions, and if there's more, then leave it in the comment section below. I'll do my best to answer your questions, and I'll see you guys on my next video. Until next time.